From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations present and past who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with BGSU student Marissa Bramble and her faculty mentor, Megan Docherty. Marissa is a fifth-year senior majoring in psychology and social work. Marissa hopes to earn a PhD in clinical psychology and have a career as a practicing therapist, researcher, and educator. Dr. Megan Docherty is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. Her research interests are the development of aggression and delinquency and the influences of parenting and exposure to violence and trauma. Two of her specific research areas are callous, unemotional traits from childhood to adulthood and handgun carrying in adolescence and young adulthood. In the summer of 2022, Marissa, with the help of Dr. Docherty, worked on the research project Polyvictimization in Juveniles and Its Association with Delinquent Behaviors. This project was funded by the Center for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, or CURS. CURS provides funding for undergraduate students to pursue research, scholarly, or creative projects with a faculty mentor in their chosen discipline. Thank you two for joining me today. Marissa, to begin, would you introduce us to your project and talk a little bit about what got you interested in this issue?
So I am interested in trauma and how that affects people's behaviors. Specifically, when I was younger, my mom worked at a group home for juvenile sex offenders and rehabilitating them back into society. And that piqued my interest. And I mainly because a lot of her clients had experienced trauma themselves, and that made them become offenders, or was at least correlated with that. As a child, I thought that made them become offenders. As I've continued my education, I realized that there is a lot of correlations between adverse childhood experiences and delinquent behaviors in adolescence and adulthood. So I wanted to do some research on that.
Your project in the title has the term polyvictimization. Could you explain what that means and sort of how, from a disciplinary perspective, you are thinking about those ideas?
Yes. So polyvictimization is a term that means multiple victimizations. For our project, we decided to classify victimizations as sexual assault, psychological abuse, physical abuse. We looked at multiple victimizations. We categorized those victimizations by certain traits or experiences within the data set. And then if there was one or more of those, that is what grouped into that victimization.
Megan, could you provide some context for this project and for kind of how you two together went about, identifying research subjects and what you were hoping to understand better through this project?
Sure. So Marissa had reached out to me about doing this project, and we first just started talking about what her research interests were, what types of experiences she wanted to have, what questions she thought were interesting. And so after communicating with her for a little bit about what these interests might be, we decided that she was interested in looking at different types of victimization and how those might be related to delinquency primarily, but also things like post-traumatic stress. And once we identified that, I let her know that I had worked with this data set previously, this long scan data set that looks at children who were either maltreated or at very high risk for experiencing maltreatment. And so we decided that would be a good data set to use for this project, since we're talking about relatively lower base rate, lower prevalence experiences, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse. And so, we were able to identify that data set and then from there just sort of work on some of our ideas and hypotheses.
How did this project fit within your own research expertise?
Sure. So I am interested in things like exposure to violence, parental influences more broadly. Again, I've worked with this data set before, so I looked at things like maltreatment predicting conduct problems and lack of guilt in adolescents. So I study callous and emotional traits, youth who seem to lack guilt, lack empathy, lack emotion, and remorse. And so it does look like for those youth who experience maltreatment, particularly very early, so in the first few years of life, again, particularly if they experience multiple different types of victimization or have multiple instances of maltreatment, they're particularly likely to develop conduct problems, delinquency, aggression, problems like that later on in adolescence. And so I felt like this project fit pretty well within my own expertise since I do look at things like delinquency, maltreatment, victimization. And so it was nice that Marissa's research interests sort of aligned with my own for this project.
Marissa, could you talk us through your research methods and some of the key findings?
Yeah, so unexpectedly, the data portion was more complicated. I thought it would be really easy because it's secondary data. I don't have to go out and collect it myself. That was wrong. But pretty much when I went to Dr. Docherty, I told her that I was interested in studying trauma and how that affected delinquent behaviors. And so the first part of that was determining what trauma was and what portion of trauma we wanted to look at. What we identified is that we wanted to look more broadly at maltreatment. And so then within that, we had to identify what that meant. And while we're trying to figure this out, we're also looking at the data set. Because it wasn't organically collected from us, we had to see if what we wanted to look at aligned with the data that we already had. And so from there, we decided to go with broad topics of sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and physical abuse. Within those, though, there are different subgroups that we could have chosen, but we decided to make it easier by looking at the broad group. Then from there, we wanted to see how that affected delinquent behaviors. And that is also kind of a broad subject, and so we had to define that for ourselves. And so for that, we made another broad topic off of subgroups. And so delinquent behaviors do include things like staying out past curfew, stealing, gang involvement, carrying weapons, missing school. We did not factor into that actual arrest records that we didn't feel would be beneficial for what we were trying to gauge. And then from there, we also wanted to take a look at post-traumatic stress scores. And with that, they actually had a raw collection of that was already scored for us. So that was the simple part in our analysis. What we found from our data is that there was significant correlation between 2 to 3 victimizations and delinquent behaviors overall. We did look at some subsets of gender and race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. It was more prevalent in males to have delinquent behaviors than females. There wasn't any significant correlations with socioeconomic status, nor with race and ethnicity. Although there were some interesting findings within them, they weren't significant statistically. And then we did find as well that there was a correlation with increased victimizations and post-traumatic stress scores, more prevalent in female than male. And that goes back to one of our hypotheses that males externalize their victimizations, whereas females internalize their victimizations.
Megan, could you kind of step back from that and sort of give us a sense of the implications of these findings for listeners who might not sort of know the ins and outs of the research?
Yeah, sure. So I think this research really speaks to, again, with polyvictimization, we're not looking at different instances of victimization, but different multiple types of victimization. And so what our findings suggest is that it's not, once you've had an abuse experience, right, that's sort of it. There's no additional impact of other types of experience. What we're finding is, yes, there is an additive impact of if you've experienced physical abuse as well as psychological abuse, right? There's going to be this additive impact of a second type of victimization experience. And so those youth who are being exposed to multiple different types will be at greater risk for delinquency, for post-traumatic stress. And so just having that understanding for youth who are maybe already in contact with child protective services, possibly in foster care, understanding that those who have these more diverse victimization experiences are potentially at greater risk for experiencing some of these negative outcomes, unfortunately.
If we think about kind of what we do with some of this research, what other questions does it open up or opportunities for thinking about treatment pathways or how to, more effectively support young people who are the victims of violence so that, they don't get into delinquent behaviors or suffer from the worst effects of post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, that's a very good question to ask because that is a question that personally drove my research. I think what we found with this is that we need to do research on early interventions, that once someone has experienced one type of victimization, it's very important within the system. So that includes school systems, child protective service systems, and even community systems, that we are intervening to give them support and to also protect against further victimizations. Once you get to 2 different types of victimizations and 3 types of victimizations, that's when they're more at risk for delinquent behaviors and post-traumatic stress. So now the next step would be to study what types of interventions are most successful to support young children who may experience one type of victimization or even multiple types of victimization. And as I continue on with my career, I would like to study what's a vital age to step in, what's a good type of therapy to use to intervene to protect them from those delinquent behaviors later on.
I think what Marissa said was great. Certainly earlier intervention, the earlier we can ideally prevent these types of things from happening, but certainly step in and intervene as soon as possible once youth have had these types of experiences. And certainly we were looking at victimization predicting delinquency rather than starting with a sample of youth who were maybe in the juvenile justice system or had been arrested and looking at their trauma histories. But I do think this aligns with a lot of work in the delinquency literature suggesting that these youth who end up in the system, who may be arrested, tend to have histories of maltreatment, victimization, and therefore require more trauma-informed care potentially. And so just having that sensitivity and that understanding to be able to intervene with those youth and help them experience, more positive outcomes in the future, I think is helpful.
You've suggested as well, Marissa, that there are real gender dimensions to this, right? The broad strokes that boys tend to externalize their trauma, whereas girls tend to internalize. Do you see any, potential therapeutic implications for that data?
Definitely. I'm still young in my education as far as the clinical aspects and interventions that we have, but just from the knowledge that I do have, it's important to understand that with females and internalizing their trauma, that can present as one, having PTSD because they tested high on these post-traumatic stress scales. But a lot of times that will present in teenagers as depression, anxiety, eating disorders, anxiety disorders. And so having an understanding that when you treat that, having trauma-informed care with that can be really beneficial. And then for those that externalize, a lot of times that can show up for our boys as acting out in class and even getting to the degree of entering the juvenile justice system. And like Dr. Docherty mentioned, having trauma-informed care when working with those young individuals is very vital to their success of rehabilitation and then staying out of the system as they enter adulthood.
And what you're really suggesting is that, any kind of one-size-fits-all approach is going to, be inadequate to really address the full spectrum of symptoms and causes.
Definitely. I think the broadest way that you can address it is always having trauma-informed care in how you approach young adults who may have experienced victimizations.
And for folks who don't know, how would you define trauma-informed care?
The easiest way that I can explain it, and everyone can use this technique in their day-to-day, is anyone that you talk to, assume that they have experienced some sort of trauma in their life and that things that you say or do can be triggering to that trauma. So just being aware of how you talk to people and the way you talk to people is really important.
Megan, from your position and your experience, what are some of the ways that folks can practice trauma-informed care?
That's a great question. I do want to add the caveat. I'm not a clinician or a clinical psychologist, so I do just want to add that that's not my specific area of expertise. Hopefully Marissa will one day go on to get that PhD and have that area of expertise. But in terms of how people can practice trauma-informed care, I think what Marissa said summarizes it really nicely. Just having that understanding that it is more common than I think people outside of the field would guess initially. And just having that sensitivity around, these aren't people who are acting out just to act out or, it's not always this goal-oriented behavior. Sometimes they don't necessarily understand the reasons for why they're doing something. And so having that sensitivity and that guidance and therapy can be really important in helping them sort of navigate that trauma and maybe what some of the underlying experiences are that they've had and how they can cope with those experiences moving forward.
We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today I'm speaking with BGSU student Marissa Bramble and assistant professor Dr. Megan Docherty. The two collaborated on a research project funded by the Center for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, CURS, here at BGSU. Marissa, the study refers to interventions. Can you talk about what some of those are in the context of your research?
So in the context of our research, as far as how early interventions could be beneficial to adolescents would be, so that's kind of like a more broad aspect. We wanted to acknowledge that interventions are helpful, and that can really vary based on community needs. But that could be as simple as having more social workers available in schools or clinical psychologists available in schools who can pick up on certain behaviors that could be correlated with trauma that has been experienced, as well as having those that are involved with child protective services understanding that once you have hit a certain amount of traumatic experiences or maltreatments, that they're at greater risk for certain behaviors. So interventions is a broad way, but there are so many different minute routes you can take to instill those interventions based on that specific community.
And part of what you're really talking about is a mindset shift in the folks who might be interacting with these young people, instead of presuming you're acting out because you want to get my goat or you are trying to disrupt class, right? Sort of the intervention is sort of trying to understand the root causes of some of that behavior and bringing more of a curiosity towards those interactions rather than kind of leading with discipline.
Definitely. It's very common to see when you mention these interventions that in that moment, that behavior that is directed towards you is typically not about you. It is about something that they are going through that they may not even completely understand themselves.
How did you first come to reach out to Dr. Docherty for this project?
So I had Dr. Docherty as my professor in the fall last year for developmental psychology. I thought she was really cool. The first day of class, she talked about research she was interested in her history with her academics, and I thought that was really cool because it's very similar to what I want to do. So I reached out to her asking if she had any research that I could help with, and at that time she did not. But we still continued to talk after the semester, and we saw that there was this CURS grant opportunity, and she mentioned this data set she had been working with that I could do research more focused on what I was interested in, which was super cool. And we decided together to apply for the grant and do this research.
What was the process like for working together on this project? Megan, you want to lead that off?
Yeah, I think the process, for the most part, at least between Marissa and myself, felt very smooth. Again, our research interests aligned. It felt like we had a lot of things in common, and we communicated very well throughout the project. There were some hiccups. I think Marissa nodded to this before, just in terms of the data set. So this was a secondary data analysis project. We did not collect data, but we acquired access to the data set from the organization that had collected the data. And so there were hiccups in terms of just obtaining the data set itself. And then once we obtained the data, just navigating it, figuring out what we had, doing some cleaning and coding. And so I think all of those processes ended up taking a little bit longer and a little bit more effort than we had initially anticipated. But other than those hiccups, I think the process overall was very smooth. The CURS folks make it very easy to sort of navigate that process and be able to, work with the student, get the CURS individuals the files that they need. So yeah, I think other than, again, the hiccups with the data, everything went really smoothly.
And how did you go about figuring out sort of what the relationship would be like? For you, Marissa, at what points were you kind of driving, the process? And at what points were you going to Megan for advice or suggestions?
So to start, our IRB process was...
And can you explain for folks what that is?
Yes, the IRB is the Institutional Review Board, and they get to decide who gets to do research by a whole list of questions. And that is just to make sure that people are doing ethical research, that they're doing meaningful research, and that no one is harmed, and that confidentiality is protected, that sort of thing. So that was a little difficult to navigate. Dr. Docherty kind of ended up having to take the lead on that towards the end because I just kept hitting like a dead end, essentially. But once we really dove into the research, we were meeting approximately every week. Sometimes, depending on the tasks she gave me, it'd be every 2 weeks. But essentially, we'd meet up. I would show her what I accomplished in that time. She would review it with me and then either work with me in that time to figure out what went wrong with our data, and then set me free to work on it some more. Once we got the data how we needed it to, I was able to work with it a little bit more easily. But it really was just open communication the whole time, giving me a task to do in between us meeting. The nice thing is I wasn't afraid to fail because I knew if it wasn't working, Dr. Docherty would be there to help me get it working. And the data tended to fail a lot that first few weeks. So
I think this is one of the kind of unspoken truths of research, right, is that it's an iterative process. It tends not to be linear, right, the best laid plans, but you get that data and then you have to kind of figure out how to work with it. So that seems like a good education into like what the process is like. Dr. Docherty, were there specific educational or skills-based outcomes that you were thinking about for Marissa that you wanted her to get out of this project?
Yeah, certainly. We were just talking about it, but certainly working with data sets, I believe we met that outcome. So just in terms of data management, data cleaning, right, being able to sort of navigate a code book, do some sort of basic variable computation, things like that. So Marissa certainly got to do some work there. And then, so as a researcher, I tend to use quantitative methods. I work with statistics, and I wanted Marissa to gain some of those skills as well. And again, I believe we were able to work on those. And so we went through running things like a regression, analysis of variance, right? These typical analyses that we'll use in psychology. So she was certainly able to work on some of those goals as well. And then finally, just written communication. So it's one thing to be able to look at the data, run some analyses, but to be able to actually write about those analyses, right? What do they mean? What are the implications? And so just having that clear written communication, I think is important. And having to write up the document for CURS, and now hopefully, ideally being able to write up a publication, Marissa was able to work on some of those written communication skills.
Could you talk a little bit, Marissa, about from your perspective, what have you gained from this process and how does it fit into your own career trajectory goals?
I have gained so much from this process. It has been frustrating and honestly the most rewarding thing I think I've done in my academic career so far. I got to feel more confident in how I work with statistical software. I'm still not perfect at it, but I learned so much with how to use data, how to syntax data. That sounds really fancy, and I feel really cool that I can do that. I also got to work with application processes, which is going to be very important for my career. I will be working with the institutional review board a lot as a doctoral student someday, and then as a researcher myself. And now we're still working on the publication process, and that has helped me to learn how to write more academically. I've always felt like I'm a good writer as far as papers for classes, but there is another level to publication writing that I get to now experience and work on, which is, to a certain degree, feels like a never-ending process of constant review. But every time you learn a new way to word something that sounds more academic. And for someone like me, who's a young, ambitious Black woman in this field, which, by the way, I'm going to plug, only 4% of mental health providers are people of color. So going into that world as an undergraduate student, having a basic understanding of that academic process and rigor going in as a doctoral student, that experience will be unmatched and will be very beneficial to set me on a trajectory to success.
Dr. Docherty, if there are faculty members listening, do you have any advice for them or anything you want them to know about student-faculty partnerships for research projects like this?
Oh, that is a really good question. I'm going to lean on a little bit of what Marissa said. I think just open communication was really beneficial, and hopefully Marissa feels this way, but I felt like, it was great two-way communication. If I felt like there was a problem that needed to be addressed, I felt comfortable going to Marissa. I think hopefully same thing. If Marissa felt like, hey, I need some additional help this week, or I'm struggling with a certain thing this week and I can't meet this deadline, right? We could have these open and honest discussions with each other about what was going well, what was maybe not going so well, what we needed to do to sort of get back on track. And so I think communication was probably the number one thing. I think it probably helped that we had a little bit of familiarity. So again, Marissa was in my class, and so she wasn't just emailing me out of the blue with no introduction or no familiarity. So I think having that previous experience sort of helped in establishing our research partnership. And again, I think just sort of frequent check-ins, not going too long, say, I'll see you in a month, and hopefully everything's going smoothly that whole time, but just sort of frequently checking in. Hey, how's it going? Is there anything I can do to help? I think was really beneficial for that process.
And Marissa, for students who might be listening, what advice do you have for them if maybe they're interested in doing some research, but they're not sure where to start?
The best advice I can get is you should pursue research with a professor that you've had. I think having that connection is really important because the professor sees how you work in class. And I think having that basic understanding makes them feel a little more comfortable to take on this extra workload, because there's not a true reward for them except for mentoring a student. But then it's also important for students to prioritize their time and make sure that they are not wasting the professor's time, because they are just doing it to be nice. They don't have to. It's all because they want to, and they want you to succeed. And if you're not sure on the exact research you want to do, which is very common for undergraduate students, just ask to help with some research, because then you might find something that you are really passionate about or really interested in. Or if it's not something that you're super into, you at least learn these really cool skills that you can apply to other things.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking with you. To learn more about BGSU's Center for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, visit bgsu.edu/CURS for CURS. Listeners can keep up with ICS activities by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICSBGSU and on our Facebook page. You can listen to BG Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. Our sound engineers for this episode were Jackie Swartz and Marco Mendoza, with audio editing by Deanna McKeegan and Marco Mendoza. This podcast was researched and edited by Joseph Alaya.